Let me ask you a question. Do you own Ganyu? No? Good, neither do I. But Ganyu makes for an interesting topic given her generally high power level and simplistic playstyle. She's actually quite divisive. Personally, I found that you either love her or you hate her. Myself, I think she's good, but I'm not in love with the playstyle. But now to the point of the video though. Is it possible to make a Ganyu build without the Ganyu? There's a lot of bow characters in the game, some of which actually have some charge shot synergies. But I wanted to take it a step further though. What characters could actually hold a candle to Ganyu while being a 4-star? Originally, this just started out as a DPS Diona video, but it evolved along the way to something a lot more, well, messy. Let's start looking at some characters though, and see what we can put together. Firstly, let's get into the basics. The characters and questions that we're going to be working with are Diona, Amber, Goro, and Farazan. And yes, I know Fischl actually has some charge shot synergies in her kit, but I just made a video on her, so I figured she could use a break. I'll go into their kits individually as we go through each character and their respective teams, only going into extra details on skills and constellations that synergize with this charge shot setup. For weapons, all of them will be using the new Battle Pass weapon, Scion of the Blazing Sun, at level 90. But many other bows work for these kinds of builds, including free-to-play options like the Inazuma Crafted Bow, or more rare weapons like Amos Bow. With that, all their builds are nearly identical, using a 4-piece Wanderer's Troop set for the charge shot bonus damage, with an elemental damage bonus goblet of the appropriate type, with an exception of Farazan, but I'll cover that when we get there. Finally, for their levels and talents, all characters I'll be using will have at least level 8 talents, and their charge shot modifiers are the exact same. With all that out of the way though, let's get started with Diona. We start with her skill, Icy Paws, which deals attack scaling damage and offers a health scaling shield. For our purposes, this is fairly useless, but the small shield that we can generate can matter in some cases as it prevents interruption of our charge shots. Next is our burst, which is actually extremely important to the build, however its usefulness is not immediately obvious. More on that later. For her passives, we have a movement speed increase with a stamina cost reduction with her shield, which is nice but not overly helpful when we're trying to deal damage. Her second passive reduces the damage of enemies that are inside of her burst. This is actually really nice since we're going to need to be standing in her burst for optimal damage. More on that now. Her constellations are very much set up to support and protect rather than increase damage. However, there are two very important ones that we need to talk about. First is her C4, which is our bread and butter for this build. It decreases charge shot time by 60% when standing inside of her burst, which is a very significant speed increase, which more or less makes this possible. Her C6 also gives us a nice 200 elemental mastery bonus while her burst is active, which can make for some fairly spicy melts. For this team, I used Kazuha, Bennett, and Shenhe. To give Diona the most amount of buffs for her charge shot that I could think of. And for our first upfront damage test, it wasn't too bad. But when taking it into the Abyss, things got a little bit dicey. The damage was decent, but inconsistent. It was hard to maintain uptimes, and my survivability without a real Diona shield made things really awkward. Ultimately, the team was able to clear the Abyss, but with subpar times, and it felt pretty uncomfortable to play. Overall, I rated a C+, a passing grade, but it wasn't the best. And don't worry, at the end of the video I'll make sure to put a highlight reel of sorts to show how the runs went in a little bit more detail. Next up on the chopping block was Amber. And this was the character I had actually worked on the most, weirdly enough. I had planned on using her for another video before this idea came up, so thankfully I had her ready to go ahead of time. That aside, let's go to the skills. First up is Baron Bunny, which is fine. Not good, but fine. I've recently been playing around with Linny and have come to realize that it is really nice to have a taunt in a lot of situations. Even if Baron Bunny isn't the most versatile in its uses, its damage is middling, and even with a later constellation, it's still pretty lacking. Next up is her burst, which summons a rapid rain of arrows in a small area of effect. It applies pyro quickly, can do a hearty amount of damage, but generally isn't overly helpful for our charge shot build. For passives, we get a buff to her burst's area of effect and crit rate, which is nice, if a bit uninteresting. Next is the thing that could have made this build work, and that's the passive that increases her aim shot damage when hitting a weak spot. What's a weak spot, you ask? Headshots on human enemies, the eyes of ruin guards, that sort of stuff. they're basically always an automatic crit when you hit them. You may have also come to the same conclusion that I did when you realize that not every enemy has a realistic weak spot to hit, or those weak spots are unavailable for damage for long periods of time, making this talent sadly pretty mediocre. When it does work though, it's a nice little buff. For constellations, there are really only two that matter, her C1 and her C2. C1 makes you fire a second arrow when you fire an aim shot that does less damage than the first, which effectively just gives you a flat amount of bonus damage with each shot. It's kinda nice, but it can screw up melt timing sometimes, so you have to be aware of that. C2 allows you to detonate Baron Bunny early by landing a charge shot on Baron Bunny's foot. Like, specifically the foot. Yes, I'm aware that is oddly specific, that's just how it is. This detonation does double damage, which can be an okay amount, but it's again unrealistic and unreliable. For my first test, I was slightly disappointed. It wasn't terrible damage, but it definitely fell short of Diona's damage. When in the Abyss, however, I found her to be slightly better in practice. Now this is likely because I could comfortably use Zhongli in the team without forcing it. The clear on the other hand went at about the same rate as Diona. It wasn't exactly stellar damage, but it was absolutely clearable, and was pretty comfortable for the most part. Solid C grade to be sure. Next up was Goro. Now, why Goro? Because it's my video, and I thought it could work. Both Goro's skill and burst give a bunch of bonuses in an area to Geo characters, based on the number of Geo characters on the team. To get this full value, this meant that we had to essentially run Mono Geo with a single buff character. More on that later. Beyond that, Goro's passives and constellations all basically synergize with defense, which his charge shot sadly does not scale with. However, the general Geo buffs that he brings to the table, as well as his C6, which increases crit damage of Geo characters by 40% with 3 Geo characters, do buff his charge shot. So there was some potential here. The upfront test was, well, wasn't great, but the damage did actually surpass my expectations, so we had that going for us. The Abyss, on the other hand, gave us a whole host of additional challenges, and it wasn't great either. Honestly, it was doable, but it would have been a 0-star run on Chamber 3, so unfortunately I need to give this team a failing grade, an F. Unironically kinda fun to mess around with though. Truth be told, if Goro had any kind of defense synergy on his charge shot, I honestly think we would have had something here. Our final contestant was Farazan, and this one actually surprised me a lot. Firstly, to talk about her artifacts. She is the only one using something different due to the fact that she can take advantage of a unique synergy, and that's the Desert Pavilion set, you know, Wanderer set. It increases animo damage, but more importantly, it gives a bonus of 40% to charged attack damage, which an aim shot is a charged attack, which means we can maintain the buff the entire time. As an added bonus, I actually had a pretty good set of artifacts for this to work with at the time. As for the talents, we actually have some charge shot synergies. Firstly, her skill does a small amount of damage in an AoE, and increases the damage of her next charge shot, and gives it a slight AoE, and pulling effect. Finally, a real charge shot bonus I can sink my teeth into. Her burst, on the other hand, summons Geometry, to buff your character's animo damage while lowering your enemy's animo resistance, which she completely is able to use on her own. This is great, actually. We might actually have a real build on our hands here. For passives, we get a massive speed boost on her next charge shot after her skill, as well as an application of her animo resistance shred to those hit by the AoE. Her second passive gives her allies another damage buff based on her base attack when her burst is active, which is pretty cool. For constellations, many of them could have been helpful, especially her C6, which acts very much like Goro's C6, giving her animo characters a massive damage buff. But all we have to work with is her C1, which does give us an additional empowered charge shot after her skill, which is very important to this kind of build. But it would have been nice to have a few more cons at the time. But with these powers combined, our upfront damage looks like this. Honestly, it was pretty okay. Though the damage numbers weren't as high as some of the other characters we had tested, it was much faster than them, and more consistent. I was really thinking this might have some legs to stand on, so I took it to the Abyss, and it was proving to be a little bit better than the other characters we had tested so far. It was also a pretty fun playstyle for me, and it was a bit more active than your average Ganyu setup, given that you really needed to maintain her skill uptime to get the big damage going. Overall, I'd give it a solid B. It was fun. Pretty good, too. With all of our characters tested up, let me share the highlights from those runs, and I'll see you on the other side. And with all that said and done, I have to say that Faruzan was by far the biggest surprise. She actually pumped out a lot of damage, and had an interesting playstyle. I think with a bit more work, a weapon upgrade maybe, and some additional testing, I think we could have a real team comp that uses Faruzan as a main DPS. I also just wanted to say thank you to everyone who's been watching the videos, and especially those who've been taking time to check out my streams right here on YouTube. I have a few other projects in the pipeline for weird build ideas, but if you have any weird team or character suggestions, please leave them in the comments. And if you like what you saw and think I deserve it, please leave a like and subscribe for more. That's all from me. Cheers.